In the winter of 1878, a merchant named Jacob Hensworth arrived in Cedar Valley, Utah, carrying a leather satchel that would unveil one of the darkest family secrets in frontier history. Inside were genealogical records, birth certificates, and private letters that exposed the truth about the Fairmonts, a family that had posed as European nobility for over 3 decades while concealing a disturbing hereditary legacy. What Hensworth uncovered wasn't supernatural, but something far more chilling: a family that had deliberately cultivated manipulation, violence, and coldness across generations, leaving behind a trail of disappearances, murders, and carefully covered deceptions. The unraveling of their empire began with what seemed like an ordinary genealogical request, but led to revelations that shook the foundation of Cedar Valley. By 1878, Cedar Valley was a thriving Mormon pioneer settlement of about 400 people set against red sandstone cliffs and desert sage. Families had carved a life from the land, building prosperous farms and a close-knit community bound by faith. Among them, the Fairmonts stood unrivaled. Their sprawling 3,000-acre ranch, complete with manicured gardens, imported fruit trees, and a grand sandstone estate, embodied wealth and refinement rarely seen on the frontier. At the head of the family was Augustus Fairmont, a silver-haired patriarch who carried himself with aristocratic poise and claimed descent from Yorkshire nobility. With imported furnishings, elaborate crests, and carefully curated records, he convinced others of his lineage and superiority. Arriving in 1847 with his beautiful wife Elelena and their infant son, Theodore Augustus quickly became a leader in both business and the Mormon Church, cementing the family's dominance. The next generation strengthened their hold. Theodore, commanding and shrewd, managed the ranch. Marcus, sharp in negotiations, secured lucrative cattle deals. And their sister Isabel, celebrated for her beauty and charm, married into a wealthy Salt Lake merchant family. Their children carried the same charisma and intellect, admired for their health, leadership, and promise of continuing the family's legacy. To outsiders, the Fairmonts seemed blessed, immune to the hardships that devastated other pioneers. But beneath that polished surface lay something darker. Neighbors marveled at how the Fairmonts always triumphed in disputes, while rivals inexplicably faced illness, financial ruin, or sudden misfortune. Their influence reached far beyond Cedar Valley, with business ties stretching to Denver and San Francisco, further solidifying their role as both benefactors and silent rulers of the community. What no one suspected was that their fortune and power were built not just on wealth or intelligence, but on a bloodline engineered to perpetuate control, cruelty, and calculated survival. Jacob Hensworth arrived in Cedar Valley on a cold February morning in 1878, appearing at first to be just another traveling businessman. In truth, he was a professional genealogist from Philadelphia, hired by a wealthy Eastern family to verify inheritance claims worth more than $50,000. His research had led him west, after discovering suspicious discrepancies in the records, one of which involved a claimant named Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley. Hensworth's job was to verify the authenticity of these claims by examining original documents and speaking with potential heirs. The journey into Cedar Valley made an impression on him immediately. Among the modest homes and wooden storefronts of the settlement, the Fairmont estate loomed like an intruder from another world. Its sandstone mansion, manicured gardens, and imported luxuries gave the unsettling impression of a European manor inexplicably rooted in the Utah desert. In his journal, Hensworth later wrote that he felt he had stumbled upon a fragment of the old world preserved in the wilderness. On February 15th, he met Augustus Fairmont in the richly appointed study of the mansion. Shelves of leather-bound books, oil paintings in gilded frames, and an ornate mahogany desk set a tone of refinement. Augustus greeted him with warmth, offering imported brandy and producing a portfolio of documents that appeared to confirm the Fairmont's noble Yorkshire ancestry. To the casual observer, The collection of birth certificates, parish letters, and marriage records would have seemed beyond question. But to Hensworth's trained eye, cracks began to appear. The paper quality looked too uniform for documents supposedly spanning centuries. Official seals contained spelling errors, and handwriting across decades betrayed the same distinctive hand. When Hensworth carefully voiced these concerns, Augustus's demeanor shifted. The gracious host remained on the surface, but his eyes betrayed a cold calculation, as though he were assessing not a guest, but a threat. Augustus insisted that creative measures were sometimes necessary in preserving family legacies, and that the spirit of truth mattered more than the strict letter of documentation. The words were polished, but the warning behind them was unmistakable. That evening, Hensworth joined the Fairmonts for dinner. The setting was lavish, with fine china and crystal glassware that would have impressed even in Philadelphia. Yet what struck him most was the family itself. Beneath their polite conversation ran a current of veiled tension. They spoke of departed families and failed partnerships with unsettling detachment, as if other people's tragedies were of no more consequence than changes in the weather. The younger generation disturbed him. Most 17-year-old twins Augustus Jr. and Victoria carried themselves with an unnatural maturity, their words sharp, precise, and chillingly perceptive. When a neighbor's sudden death was mentioned, Victoria coldly remarked, "How unfortunate that Mr. Caldwell proved so inadequate to the challenges of frontier life," exchanging a knowing glance with her brother. That made Hensworth shiver. After dinner, Augustus led him back to the study for a private talk. The mask slipped further as he spoke candidly about survival on the frontier, about how misfortunes tended to befall those who opposed the Fairmonts, and how successful men learned to adapt their morals to necessity. "It would be most unfortunate," Augustus said, swirling his brandy, "if technical irregularities were to overshadow the essential truth of our heritage." The menace in his words was as polished as it was undeniable. Returning to his boarding house that night, Hensworth found his satchel had been searched, his papers disturbed, and a window left ajar. The message was clear: he was being watched. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson, the widowed proprietor, told him of an urgent message delivered in the night his mother in Philadelphia had fallen gravely ill, and he must return home immediately if he wished to see her. Hensworth knew at once it was a fabrication. His mother had written to him only days before in perfect health. The warning was as deliberate as it was ominous. The Fairmonts wanted him gone before he uncovered the truth. What unsettled Hensworth was not just the deception itself, but the precision with which it had been executed. The Fairmonts, or rather the family behind that name, had built their false legacy with a speed and efficiency that spoke of long practice. It was not forgery alone. It was strategy, organization, and a ruthless commitment to survival. Realizing that a direct challenge would be dangerous, Hensworth pretended to accept their story. He expressed concern for his mother's supposed illness, announced his immediate departure, and then quietly diverted to the county seat where official records were kept. What he uncovered there stripped away the last veneer of the Fairmont myth. The family that arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 had not been Fairmonts at all, but Fleas. Augustus Flea had purchased vast lands with gold and drafts from multiple banks, raising suspicions of hidden dealings. Even more damning records linked the Fleas to a trail of mysterious deaths in Missouri and Kansas. Communities they passed through had seen merchants, landowners, and rivals conveniently die of sudden illness. Strange accidents or tragic misfortunes, always these deaths cleared obstacles, opening opportunities that benefited the Fleas. In Missouri, a merchant who refused to sell his store died of a sudden heart attack, only for his widow to sell the property to Flea at a bargain price. In Kansas, a landowner disputing Flea's claim to farmland died when his horse threw him from a bridge later found to have been deliberately weakened. Wherever the family went, the same pattern repeated. Rivals undone by illness, Failed crops, financial ruin, or deadly accidents, never indiscriminate, always precisely targeted, always to the flea's advantage. Digging deeper, Hensworth traced their history further back to Pennsylvania, where they had lived under another name, the Fallners. Records from the 1820s and 1830s showed the same signature business partnerships ending in ruin for everyone. But the family competitors, ruined by scandal or bad fortune, rivals falling, one by one. A retired sheriff, Thomas Brennan, remembered them well. Over brandy in a Philadelphia tavern, he told Hensworth they weren't just wealthy. They were different. Always watching, studying, figuring out how to use people. It was like each member of the family had a role, as if they were soldiers in some campaign. Brennan described children drilled from an early age to observe, manipulate, and report. Business partnerships were traps designed not for mutual gain, but for access to information. Rivals were never openly attacked, rather they were maneuvered into self-destruction. A man might be tempted into a risky investment before a market collapse, or lured into a compromising situation that destroyed his reputation. The Fallners never laid the killing blow with their own hands. Instead, they created the conditions for others to fall watching as victims sealed their own fate. But Brennan's most chilling account concerned the family's view of humanity itself. He recalled hearing William Fallner refer to the rest of the community as breeding stock. A phrase tossed off casually, but not as a joke. The Fallners truly believed themselves to be superior beings, surrounded by inferiors, meant to be used, studied, and discarded. Even their own children were raised not with affection, but with a systematic, calculated program of training designed to harden them into tools of the family's ambition. Hensworth realized he was not merely uncovering fraud or inheritance disputes. He had stumbled onto the history of a bloodline that had perfected the art of power through manipulation, cruelty, and generational conditioning. What terrified him most was not what they had done in the past, but what they were grooming the next generation to do in the future. What truly terrified Jacob Hensworth wasn't just the deception, it was the cold precision with which it had been constructed. The Fairmonts, in their current guise, weren't merely liars or forgers. They were practitioners of generational manipulation, masters of creating false identities, and architects of an ideology that treated empathy as weakness and control as virtue. Rather than confront the family directly, Hensworth made a calculated choice. He pretended to accept their forged documents and the fabricated emergency that was meant to drive him from Cedar Valley. Then, under the pretense of leaving for Philadelphia, he quietly traveled to the county seat to dig deeper. What he found unraveled everything. The family that had arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 had done so under the name Flea, not Fairmont. Augustus Flea purchased his land using a suspicious patchwork of gold coins and Eastern bank drafts. But the trail didn't start in Utah. Earlier records traced the family to Kansas and Missouri, where they were tied to a series of mysterious deaths and abrupt takeovers of local businesses. In every case, those who stood in their way, whether merchants, landowners, or civic leaders, suffered sudden and catastrophic misfortunes. The incidents were never overtly criminal. A bridge collapse here, a sudden illness there. But the outcomes always benefited the Flea family, and this wasn't the beginning either. Hensworth uncovered yet another identity, the Fallners of Pennsylvania. Court records from the 1820s and 1830s described a family of calculated opportunists whose business ventures flourished while their partners encountered ruin, scandal, or tragedy. A retired sheriff, Thomas Brennan, remembered them well. To him, the Fallners weren't just ruthless, they were unnatural. He described their children as tools in a larger machine trained from a young age to observe, manipulate, and report. Brennan recalled a moment that stayed with him for decades. He saw William Fallner force his crying 8-year-old son to witness the butchering of an injured horse, then make the boy help. The child had begged for the animal to be saved. But William had said sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't afford. The family saw compassion as a flaw. They didn't simply raise children, they conditioned them. And they didn't just operate under new names, they erased their pasts with military efficiency, arriving in new communities as benevolent aristocrats, while hiding decades of quiet terror. Hensworth realized he had stumbled onto a multi-generational operation, one that weaponized social influence, emotional conditioning, and systemic fear to control communities. The transformation from Faulkner to Flea to Fairmont wasn't mere reinvention. It was a blueprint for generational conquest. Armed with that knowledge, Hensworth returned to Cedar Valley pretending to have uncovered documents that supported the Fairmont claim to the inheritance. In truth, he intended to expose them. But what he uncovered during his second visit was worse than he had imagined. Cedar Valley, once seemingly a harmonious frontier town, revealed itself to be a controlled environment. The Fairmonts held dominion not through violence, but through calculated pressure, psychological warfare, and targeted ruin. Hensworth studied families who had left over the past 30 years. Many were said to have departed for opportunity, but in truth, they had fled driven out by grief, humiliation, or fear. The Morrison family left in 1865 after their eldest son died in a supposed hunting accident. But James Morrison had been investigating corruption in a Fairmont grain contract and was days away from delivering his findings. The Caldwell family, prosperous blacksmiths, left in disgrace after Robert Caldwell suffered a breakdown. Locals said he'd accused neighbors of poisoning his animals. Within weeks, his business collapsed and was quietly purchased by Theodore Fairmont. Most unsettling was the Hartwell case. Samuel Hartwell had openly opposed a Fairmont land expansion. Within 6 months, his livestock died mysteriously, his well was poisoned, and his daughter suffered a life-altering riding accident. The family sold their land to cover medical debts and left Cedar Valley in ruin. Every family Hensworth investigated had something in common. They had stood in the Fairmont's way through politics, commerce, or knowledge. And worse still, some families didn't just leave, they vanished. The Petons, who operated a general store, supposedly moved to California, but no records ever showed their arrival. Their home was abandoned, with possessions still inside. The Jenkins family, who challenged Fairmont water rights in 1876, had allegedly gone to Colorado. Yet their homestead was found hastily abandoned fields, unharvested animals roaming free. These weren't coincidences. This was orchestration. The Fairmont family had not merely hidden a dark past, they had embedded themselves into Cedar Valley like a parasite, thriving by hollowing out everything around them. And Hensworth now understood the smiling patriarch, the obedient children, the pristine estate. None of it was accidental. It was the end result of a decades-long program of domination. This wasn't just a family legacy. It was a doctrine, a system built to endure, manipulate, and devour. Just when it seemed the horror in Cedar Valley had reached its peak, Jacob Hensworth uncovered something far more chilling: evidence, not just of deception, but of calculated murder and psychological warfare spanning generations. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the truth behind the Fairmont family is only getting darker. Hensworth's most critical breakthrough came when he gained the trust of Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, an elderly widow and lifelong resident of Cedar Valley. Now confined to her home by illness, Mrs. Sterling had meticulously documented life in the valley since its founding. Her journals, spanning decades, held the key to understanding the full scope of the Fairmont family's grip on the community. She told Hensworth that the Fairmonts didn't just influence Cedar Valley, they monitored it. Through business ties, church connections, and subtle forms of coercion, They created a web of surveillance so effective that no secret stayed hidden for long. They knew who was having marital problems, who had debts whose children were falling behind in school. And they weaponized that knowledge. The journals recorded how the Fairmonts manipulated public opinion, sabotaged rivals, and engineered community decisions. They applied pressure at precise moments, often destroying reputations or steering business deals without ever appearing involved. But the most terrifying revelation came when Mrs. Sterling described what really happened to the families who had vanished. "They didn't leave," she whispered, eyes distant. "They were taken." She recalled seeing Marcus Fairmont and two ranch hands loading something heavy into a wagon late at night, not long after the Peaton family supposedly moved to California. The wagon was headed toward the old mine shafts in the canyon. It came back empty and clean. Similar patterns appeared around the disappearances of other families. Increased activity near abandoned shafts. Unusual movement at night. Notes in her journals described wagons, men with lanterns, hurried voices. The evidence painted a horrifying picture. These families had been quietly eliminated, their remains likely disposed of in remote, inaccessible parts of Fairmont-controlled land. It became clear to Hensworth that he wasn't just tracking liars and forgers. He was facing a family that had committed serial, organized murder, operating undetected for more than 30 years. The scope of their crimes and the methodical, emotionless way they were carried out was almost beyond belief. And then Hensworth realized the Fairmonts knew he was getting too close. His second stay in Cedar Valley began to feel less like research and more like surveillance in reverse. His boarding house room was searched frequently and without subtlety, as if they wanted him to know he was being watched. Conversations with locals were disrupted by coincidental visits from Fairmont associates. More disturbingly, those he had interviewed began to change their stories, claiming they'd been mistaken or had misremembered events they'd once recounted with clarity. On his fourth night, Mrs. Patterson, the anxious boarding house owner, pulled him aside. "Mr. Hensworth," she said in a hushed voice, "it might be best if you finished your business here soon. There's talk. People are saying you're stirring up old troubles, and not everyone wants those troubles brought back." That same evening, Hensworth received another dinner invitation from the Fairmonts, delivered personally by Augustus Jr. The 17-year-old heir mirrored his grandfather's refined manner. But beneath the surface was something unnervingly cold. "My grandfather is eager to hear about your latest discoveries," Augustus Jr. said with eerie composure. "Especially how thoroughly you've studied our history and what conclusions you've reached." It was not an invitation. It was a summons. February 23rd, 1878. The second Fairmont dinner wasn't a social event. It was a psychological inquisition. The entire extended family was there, including individuals Hensworth hadn't met before. One by one, they asked polite but pointed questions, probing his findings, testing his resolve, measuring his threat. The dynamic was unmistakable. He was the defendant, and they were the silent jury. What chilled him most was not their hostility, but their confidence. Each question was framed with civility, yet carried the unmistakable weight of veiled threat. And Augustus Jr., barely a teenager, was already a master of the family's method, charm, poise, and an unwavering ability to terrify without raising his voice. The Fairmonts weren't just guarding a secret. They were safeguarding an empire built on silence, fear, and blood. Just when you thought the Fairmont family's horrors couldn't get worse, they descended into something truly monstrous. If you're still with us, gripped by the cold calculation behind every move, now's the time to share this story with a fellow dark mystery lover. Like the video to support our work and subscribe so you never miss the next twist in this terrifying tale. At that final dinner, Hensworth saw the truth in full view. The Fairmonts weren't merely corrupt or criminal. They were an organized psychological machine communicating in coded glances and layered phrases, each member playing a precise role in a carefully choreographed ritual of coercion. Elena Fairmont, the matriarch, blended grandmotherly warmth with veiled threats, her every word dipped in condescension and menace. "We take care of our own," she said sweetly, "and we're quite protective of our privacy." What had once seemed like eerie intelligence in the younger Fairmonts now revealed itself as carefully honed, predatory instinct. Victoria spoke about neighbors as if cataloging liabilities. Edgar, just 15, casually demonstrated an understanding of power dynamics that would make a corporate lawyer proud. They weren't children, they were heirs to an ideology of control. Augustus Fairmont closed the evening with an offer. He presented Hensworth with additional genealogical records, a bank draft for a substantial sum, and a thinly disguised ultimatum: accept their version of the story, take the money, and walk away. It was an elegant bribe dressed in velvet civility. When Hensworth refused, the room shifted. The facade didn't collapse, it thinned, revealing the steel beneath. "We won't allow our investment in this community to be threatened by misinterpretations," Augustus warned. Theodore, more blunt, reminded Hensworth that accidents happen especially to outsiders in unfamiliar territory. Returning to his boarding house, Hensworth found his room ransacked. All his notes, copies, and correspondence gone. Mrs. Patterson, shaken, explained that men claiming to be officials had served a fraudulent warrant accusing him of theft and fraud. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, terrified. "They have more power here than anyone." The Fairmonts hadn't just destroyed his work, they'd erased his ability to fight back. But instead of fleeing, Hensworth made what he later called the most dangerous decision of his life. He would go to the old mine shafts. He would find the proof. On the night of February 24th, 1878, cloaked in freezing wind and moonlight, Jacob Hensworth made his way to the abandoned copper mines 2 miles from the Fairmont estate sites long dismissed as relics of failure. Mrs. Sterling had seen increased activity there. Now Hensworth would find out why. The first shaft was sealed with rocks and debris, but fresh disturbance betrayed recent use. With tools borrowed from the boarding house, he cleared an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. The moment the air hit his face, he knew. The sickly sweet stench of death mixed with lime and rot was unmistakable. By lantern light, he descended into the darkness. What he found would forever change his understanding of evil. The shaft had been transformed into a mass grave. Human remains, at least a dozen, were laid out with unsettling precision. These weren't hurried burials. These were deliberate disposals. Scattered among the bones were objects Hensworth recognized. A child's shoe, a wedding ring, a pocket watch with initials carved into the back belonging to Samuel Hartwell. Clothing scraps belonging to the Peaton children. Artifacts of lives erased. Families the community had believed gone proven, now to be victims of the Fairmonts' long campaign of terror. But it was the final discovery that struck deepest. Hidden in a crevice of the mine wall wrapped in oiled cloth was a ledger. It bore Augustus Fairmont's signature in unmistakable handwriting. Inside were decades of entries, each one coldly labeled necessary elimination. From 1847 to the present day, the ledger documented the deaths, disappearances, and engineered disasters that had secured the Fairmont family's dominance. It included dates, methods, justifications, and names. Names of men, women, and children, each one reduced to a liability on a ledger sheet. This wasn't random violence. This was a generational operation of murder masked as progress. Just when the darkness surrounding the Fairmont family seemed complete, the true depth of their atrocities was laid bare, meticulously documented in a ledger that read, like a corporate crime report, stripped of empathy and stained with the weight of decades of silent death. Each entry was chillingly precise. The victim's name, the date of death, the method used, and a calculated justification. Robert Caldwell, March 15th, 1872. Arsenic poisoning over 6 weeks. Discovered irregularities in grain contracts. Elimination necessary to preserve family security. Another entry detailed the murder of the Jenkins family, chloroform and manual strangulation because they had hired legal counsel over a water rights dispute. Elimination of entire family necessary to prevent legal complications. Page after page told the same story: cold-blooded, calculated murder executed under the guise of frontier accidents. The ledger listed over 30 individuals, each death planned to appear natural or accidental, each marked not as tragedy, but as a cost-saving measure. The Fairmonts had built not just a culture of silence, but a system of murder, complete with cost-benefit analyses, comparing a victim's threat level to the resources required for their removal. Human lives were line items in an empire of terror. As Hensworth photographed the evidence using his portable camera, he heard footsteps echoing from above. Then came the voice of Augustus Fairmont, refined, commanding, and utterly devoid of mercy. "The genealogist has proven more resourceful than anticipated," he said. "His refusal to accept our reasonable offer indicates he now represents a permanent threat. This situation requires immediate resolution." They had come to kill him. Trapped, outnumbered, and cornered, Hensworth acted quickly. He hid the ledger and his photographic plates in a crevice of the mine before attempting to escape through a secondary shaft. But the tunnel was unstable, and falling rocks gave away his location. Moments later, Augustus and his sons Theodore and Marcus cornered him. They weren't alone. Several ranch hands accompanied them, men who had clearly been involved in the family's hidden crimes for years. Mr. Hensworth, Augustus said calmly, "You've demonstrated admirable dedication to your work, but I'm afraid your investigation ends here." He spoke as if discussing a business inconvenience, not a murder. Theodore laid out plans for staging a cave-in, while Marcus explained how to make it appear as though Hensworth had simply left town before his fatal accident. Their tone was professional, cold, practiced. This was not their first cover-up, it was policy. But just as all hope seemed amazed, a voice echoed through the shaft. "Augustus Fairmont, this is Territorial Sheriff Bradley. I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with multiple missing persons cases. Come out with your hands visible and bring Mr. Hensworth with you unharmed." In that instant, the predator became the prey. Mrs. Sterling, defying her frail health, had followed Hensworth into the canyon. She had contacted Sheriff Tom Bradley from the territorial capital, and he had arrived with deputies armed, ready, and determined to bring justice. The standoff that followed stretched for nearly an hour. Augustus tried every tool in his arsenal, bribes, charm, and threats. But this time, none of it worked. By dawn on February 25, 1878, the Fairmont family's reign of terror was over. Sheriff Bradley and his men arrested Augustus Fairmont, his sons, and the complicit ranch hands. The evidence gathered by Hensworth, the photographic records, the journal entries from Mrs. Sterling, and the gruesome discovery of human remains in the mine formed an ironclad case. The ledger was the final nail written in Augustus's own hand, chronicling over 30 murders across 3 decades and multiple territories. The Fairmonts had operated with impunity for 30 years, their crimes hidden beneath charm, wealth, and influence. But they had underestimated one man's resolve and one elderly woman's memory. The full horror of the Fairmont family's legacy came into focus only after their arrest. What began as a local investigation in Cedar Valley quickly escalated into the exposure of one of the most methodical, cold-blooded criminal enterprises in American frontier history. Sheriff Tom Bradley's team, assisted by territorial investigators, uncovered multiple additional disposal sites scattered across the Fairmont estate. In secluded corners of the property, they found burial pits, shallow graves, and traces of chemical decomposition methods refined to near perfection. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a laboratory hidden beneath one of the estate's outbuildings, complete with labeled vials, handwritten toxin formulas, and chemical notes detailing the best substances for inducing heart failure, respiratory paralysis, and undetectable poisoning. It was clear the family hadn't merely used poisons, they had researched them, improved upon them, and weaponized them as part of a broader system of social control. Inside the mansion itself, investigators discovered hidden compartments containing forged identity documents, genealogical forgeries, and letters referencing the family's previous operations in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Kansas, names and locations that confirmed what Jacob Hensworth had long suspected the Fairmonts had simply been the latest identity in a generational cycle of reinvention and infiltration. But the most unsettling find of all was a collection of psychological dossiers. Filed meticulously in the family's private study, these documents detailed intimate profiles on nearly every resident of Cedar Valley. Each file contained notes on behavioral patterns, financial pressures, personal secrets, marital tensions, and leverage points. Everything the family could use to manipulate, bribe, or blackmail. These weren't just neighbors to the Fairmonts. They were assets to control or liabilities to eliminate. The town hadn't been a community, it had been a living system the Fairmonts cultivated, exploited, and fed upon. The trial that followed was nothing short of a national spectacle. Held in Salt Lake City during the summer of 1878, the Fairmont trial drew crowds from across the country. Reporters from New York, Boston, and Chicago filled the courthouse galleries. The idea that a family of so-called aristocrats had manipulated and murdered their way through American settlements for over 30 years captivated a nation just beginning to understand the complexities of psychological crime. Witness testimony painted a portrait of generational moral decay. Prosecutors revealed how the Fairmont children had been raised in an environment designed to extinguish compassion and enforce emotional detachment. Multiple former employees, tutors, and community members described scenes of training that included exposure to violence, rehearsals of manipulative dialogue, and exercises in desensitization. This was not a family, it was a machine. The defendants showed no remorse. Augustus Fairmont, calm and composed on the stand, delivered one of the most chilling testimonies ever recorded in a criminal trial. "We simply recognized realities that others choose to ignore," he stated. "Society rewards intelligence, decisiveness, and dominance. Those who fail to act in their own defense deserve their fate. We acted out of necessity, not malice." He defended his decades of murder and manipulation as natural selection, suggesting that those who had been eliminated were inferior, weak, foolish, or emotionally unstable. His tone was analytical, even smug, as he described how each death had been weighed against potential benefit and risk. Court officials later remarked that it was not his admissions that disturbed them most, but the rational ease with which he described eliminating dozens of human beings. Elena Fairmont was equally dispassionate. In her testimony, she explained the family's educational model for child development. She spoke in clinical terms about emotional conditioning, noting that children who exhibited unproductive empathy were given corrective instruction. These included witnessing animal killings, participating in emotionally charged scenarios, and being evaluated for their composure. By adolescence, she said, our children understood that emotional sentiment had no place in decision-making. Attachment leads to hesitation. Hesitation invites failure. But it was the younger generation's statements that chilled the courtroom to silence. Victoria Fairmont, when asked about her role in the family's crimes, simply replied, "I don't understand the question." When pressed further about her feelings toward the families they had helped eliminate, she seemed confused by the idea of guilt. They weren't assets. They were problems. We managed them. Edgar Fairmont calmly discussed his knowledge of legal manipulation, surveillance techniques, and community control strategies. For someone barely 15, his awareness of coercive tactics and his total emotional detachment stunned even veteran prosecutors. None of them denied the murders. None of them expressed guilt. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. The photographic documentation, the mass graves, the ledger of killings, the forgeries, the psychological profiles, all combined to dismantle the illusion of the Fairmont legacy and expose it for what it truly was, a multi-generational cult of control power and calculated violence. They were obstacles to our family's security and prosperity. Removing obstacles is simply rational behavior. With those chilling words, the Fairmont legacy was sealed. The trial ended with the conviction of all adult Fairmont family members, Augustus, Elelena, Theodore, and Marcus, on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. They were sentenced to death by hanging. The younger generation, being minors, received lengthy prison terms with the possibility of rehabilitation. But court records and post-trial reports indicate that efforts to undo their conditioning proved deeply ineffective. They remained emotionally detached, indifferent to the suffering they had caused, proof that decades of calculated training had stripped them of basic human empathy. The Fairmont estate was seized by territorial authorities, its wealth liquidated to compensate the families of their victims. The mine shafts where bodies had been disposed of were sealed permanently. In their place, a modest memorial was erected in Cedar Valley, marking the spot where dozens of lives had been extinguished under the guise of civility and refinement. The newspapers called it the Fairmont family murders. The name became a symbol of how evil can thrive behind polished doors and gentle smiles. Jacob Hensworth returned to Philadelphia a changed man. Though he continued his genealogical research, his encounter with the Fairmonts shifted his life's mission. He became a leading figure in exposing fraudulent family histories, specializing in detecting forged documents, falsified backgrounds, and multi-generational cover-ups. His 1879 account, The Fairmont Deception, a true account of America's most dangerous family, became a national bestseller and is now considered one of the earliest foundations of criminal psychology in the United States. Hensworth's writings were more than just a personal chronicle, they were a warning. His study revealed how antisocial behaviors could be passed down not through genetics alone, but through structured psychological conditioning. The Fairmont children hadn't inherited violence. They were trained to see people as tools, threats, or expendable liabilities. Their capacity for evil wasn't a curse. It was a curriculum. The case sent shockwaves across the country. If an entire family could operate as a covert, multi-generational death cult hidden behind social respectability, how many others might exist? Investigators began to question the backgrounds of other prominent families, especially in remote frontier communities. Panic gave rise to paranoia, but also to reform. New laws were introduced requiring more rigorous background verification, and genealogical claims, once taken at face value, were now investigated with suspicion. The Fairmonts thrived in isolation. Cedar Valley's remoteness, its dependency on social harmony, and its lack of outside oversight allowed them to shape the town into a private theater of control. They preyed on trust, on tradition, on the idea that evil wears a monster's face, when in truth it often wears a smile and passes the collection plate. Their downfall revealed more than a family's crimes. It exposed the cracks in a growing nation. The story of the Fairmonts remains a grim reminder of how power, when left unchecked in hidden corners, can rot into something monstrous. So what do you think? Was everything revealed? Or did even darker secrets die with the Fairmonts? Could other families have operated under different names, in other valleys, in other towns, where the lights didn't shine and the law rarely reached? Let us know in the comments and share your theories on how deep this darkness might have gone. If you found this story compelling, share it with someone who loves chilling mysteries. Tap the like button to support our channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the American frontier holds many more secrets, and together, we'll keep digging them up. See you in the next video.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.